In this video, we're going to look at how OpenAI function calling works, and then we're going to use OpenAI functions to build an application with Next.js and TypeScript. A few weeks ago, OpenAI announced the release of function calling, which is a new API and feature that's available to the chat completions API. Now, when I first heard about this, it didn't make a ton of sense, so I really wanted to understand it, and in order to understand it, I built something with it. And then after building something with it, it became really clear about how this would work. So in this video, I'm hoping to really cover that concisely, but also really clearly. So by the time you're done with this, you have a really good understanding of where you might use this and how you might use this. Now, if we go here to the function calling documentation in the release blog post, it says that developers can now describe functions and have the model intelligently choose to output a JSON object containing arguments to those functions. This is a new way to more reliably connect GPT's capabilities with external tools and APIs. So when I first heard about this, and this might sound dumb, but I thought we would be creating like functions and uploading them to OpenAI and then maybe calling those from our app or something like that. But in reality, all we're really doing is defining an array of different options that we want to choose from. And we give a description to each one of those options, and then OpenAI will contextualize the request and see if it matches one of those options. And if so, it will return some type of object that we can then use in the next step of our own code. So we give it like 1, 2, 3, or 4, or X number of options, and then we send the request. And if the request sounds like it matches one of those options, it will then give us a response that we can then use in the next step of our own code. So typically you have multiple steps here, or, because you'll take one of those results and then maybe call another function or do something like that. You could also just take the results and return some static output. But I think most of the time you're going to be either making recursive calls to an API like ChatGPT or some other API like we're going to do in this example. So some use cases that they list here are creating chatbots that answer questions by calling external tools, converting natural language to API calls or database queries, or extracting structured data from text. Now, this isn't something that you couldn't have done before. It's just something that you can do a lot more easier now. And it's also somewhat similar to the OpenAI ChatGPT plugins that were available and that are still available, but it kind of brings that API home to you that anyone can really use in any application. So the app that we're going to be building is going to have just a single text input, and based on what the user types, we're going to be taking an action. The actions that we're going to have as options are going to either be audio generation based on text, image generation based on text, or we might just make a generic call to the OpenAI chat completions API. And the API that we're going to be using to generate audio and to generate images is going to be Replicate. So in order for you to follow through with this, if you're going to be coding along, you're going to need an OpenAI API key as well as a Replicate API key. So if you've never used Replicate, it's really great. And their description is that Replicate lets you run machine learning models with a few lines of code without needing to understand how machine learning works. So people upload their models here. We get to choose from whatever one that we like. All we need to do to interact with these is to submit our API key in an API request along with whatever parameters that are needed. So there's all types of models. The two that we're going to be working with are going to be this text to image model and this text to audio model. And here you see that we have some kind of examples of how you might check out the different properties that you can pass in. We're going to be using the function calling to determine some of these API inputs. So if nothing is defined, we're not going to pass in anything. But if someone says, if we want to make this duration 5 seconds or 20 seconds, we're going to detect that based on what they type using the functions API. So with that being said, that's all we need to do to intro all this stuff. And what we want to do now is go ahead and create a new application and start writing some code. So we'll start by creating a new Next.js application. We'll choose TypeScript, ESLint, and Tailwind. We'll choose no to src directory, yes to app router, and no to customizing the import alias. Next, we'll go ahead and change into the new directory, and we'll open this up in our text editor. And the two main files that we're going to be, or folders I would say we're going to be working in, are going to be app folder and this page.tsx file. And then we're going to create a new folder called API, and this is going to be where our API is going to go. Before we keep going though, we need to go ahead and install one dependency, and that is going to be Replicate. Now this can be done using either npm, yarn, pnpm, or whatever your favorite package manager is. But we'll go ahead and install that, and then we're kind of done with all of our dependencies, which really was just a single dependency. But what we want to do now is create our API keys and store them as environment variables. So I'm going to create a new file called .env.local. And here we're going to be setting up a couple of environment variables. The first one is going to be OpenAI API key, and the other is going to be replicate token. And we're going to go to our dashboard for replicate here, and we're going to go to API tokens, and I'm going to copy this one. Don't worry, when this tutorial's over, I'm going to reset this, but I'm going to keep it public here because I don't really care because I'm going to be updating it anyway. We have our replicate token there, and then if I go to OpenAI and I go to my view API keys, I'm going to create one just for this tutorial. I'll copy that and I'll set that here. And now we're good to go. We have our OpenAI and our replicate token and API key set. And now we can start writing some code. So we're going to be updating the page.tsx file last. First, we're going to go ahead and create our API. So in the API folder, I'm going to create a new folder called GPT. And then here, I'm going to create a file called route.ts. And this is going to be the only route that we really need. To get started, we're going to go ahead and import the next request and next response from next server. And then we're going to import replicate. Next, we're going to go ahead and set the value of replicate to initialize a new instance of replicate, passing in auth as the only property using the replicate token that we just defined. Next, we're going to go ahead and create some values that we're going to be using to interact with OpenAI. So we're going to go ahead and set a variable called key to be set as the OpenAI API key. We're going to set the base URI as the OpenAI chat completions endpoint. And then we're going to set a variable called headers that is going to be what we pass along with the base URI to interact with the OpenAI API. Now, there's also an OpenAI JavaScript SDK that you can use. It's fine, but I enjoy just using the base endpoints because it's pretty simple to do and it doesn't add any additional complexity. Next, we're going to go ahead and create our general configuration for interacting with OpenAI. And I'm just going to create an object called data, and this is just going to be the model that we're interacting with. Now, the functions API as of today supports GPT 3.5 Turbo, I believe, and GPT-4, but I found much better, I would say, response from the GPT when I'm using GPT-4 with the functions. Next, we're going to go ahead and create our main function here. We're going to say export async function post, and this is going to be taking in a request. So we're going to be using a post as opposed to a get. And then we're just going to set like a try catch block here. And in the catch block, we will simply console.log if there's an error, and then we'll return an error property with the error if that does happen. And in the first line of code, we're going to go ahead and try to get the body or whatever values passed in. And in our case, we're going to be passing in a query variable. And this is going to be what the user is asking for. Next, we're going to go ahead and create an object. And this is going to be the request that we're sending in to OpenAI's API. The first thing we want to go ahead and pass in is the model. So we're just going to submit all of the values that are here in this data by spreading over them. Next, we're going to submit the messages property, which is the same thing. This is the exact API request you would typically send to the chat completions API. All you really need is the model and the messages. And then you can also have like a system prompt here, but all we're going to be working with is the user and the content. The role and the content. So this alone could probably work, but what we want to do now is add a new section called functions. And this is just going to be an array of functions. And each of these functions needs a name, a description, and then parameters. The name is just going to be what is output from the API if this matches. So we can do like a switch or a check to see if the function name equals this, we can take a certain action. And each of these is going to be like an object. So what we want to first check is if the user is asking to create an image. So we'll set a name of this called create image. And then next we want to set the description, which is going to be the context that is checked to call this function. So this needs to be descriptive enough to where you're hoping to be able to say if the user types in something, the input needs to match this, hopefully, in order to call this function. So in this case, we're saying call this function if the request asks to generate an image. So if I type in create an image or create a photo or something like that, we're hoping that this will be enough to end up matching this in order to call this. All right, next we're going to set the parameters. And this is going to be an object. And this can have different properties. For us, the type that we're going to first set is an object. And then this object is going to have its own properties. So we'll set properties. And this can be a number of properties. So this can be 1, it could be 5 or 10, but these are going to be all the different properties that would be returned from this in order for us to pass it on to maybe the next function that we're going to be using. So the first for us is going to be the prompt. And in our case, for image, this is going to be the only property. And the type for this is going to be string. And for the description, we're going to say the exact prompt passed in. Now this properties object is going to return all of the different values that we're going to be using if we get a match here. So you can have, again, multiple properties here, but the key is going to be this value, and the value is going to be based on what you pass in here. So in this case, the key should be the prompt, and then the value should be whatever the user types in here. Now you can also contextualize the description here. So I could say the exact prompt passed in without any numbers or without any letters or whatever I kind of say here will also be taken into consideration. So for instance, if I want to take a property that's passed in and do some type of transformation, you could describe that here and get that as well. And we're going to see that in just a moment when we do the create audio configuration. So for create image, this will be triggered if this description's matched. We'll be returned an object with a prompt as the key, and the value will be the prompt that the user passes in. Now, where did we get this prompt value? Well, this came directly from the API here for Replicate. So the prompt here is just a value that we're passing into the API. And you're going to see that in just a moment. The other value that we want to take into consideration is for creating audio. So we'll create a function name called create audio. And here we'll use a similar description as we did earlier, or here we might call this create music. And what we're going to say is call this function if the request asks to generate music. And for the parameters, we're going to have very similar parameters as we had just a moment ago. So we might even be able to copy and paste these here. Whoops. So we have a type of object, properties, type, string, description, the exact prompt passed in. Now, why are we copying that? Well, the API is the same, so it also takes a prompt here for the audio. Now, but let's expand on this, and this is going to be kind of where the power, I think, of all of this stuff starts being shown. And what I want to do is describe maybe like a duration, for example. So let's create a new key that we're going to be having in this properties. And the type for this will be a number. And the description will be if the user defines a length for the audio or music, or for a duration, return the number only. I think that should work. And what's going to happen is if they say create some music that sounds like Kanye West, then the only thing that's going to be returned is this. If they say create some music that sounds like Kanye West, that's 10 seconds long, then we should get an additional key called duration with that 10. So, and that will be passed into the API here as this key. And obviously we can add additional keys. So we can basically describe all of these different things in natural language, which is kind of the whole idea here. So now that we've created our request data object, we can now use that request data to interact with the OpenAI API. So what we're going to say is const response is equal to await fetch. We're going to pass in the base URI. We're going to pass in the headers. And then we're going to stringify the request data, which is that object that we just created there. Next, we're going to get the first response from that. That is going to be the JSON.choices 0th item, which is the first item in the array. And then based on that choice, we can kind of figure out if a function call has been returned or not. So we're going to say const function call is equal to choice.message. And then what we can do now is basically we're going to log out that function call. And then we can do kind of like an if-else statement based on that. So we can say if function call, else something else. So if there is a function call, we're going to call replicate. If there isn't a function call, we're just going to return the information that was returned there. So let's go ahead and do that. So if there is no function call, we're just going to take that response and we're going to return it to the client by calling nextResponse.json. And then we're going to have a data property, and the type is going to be text. And this type property on our client is going to be how we understand the response that's coming back from our API. So we'll have a type of text, type of audio, and then we'll have like a type of music. And then what we can do now is we can say if the function call .name is a specific thing, we can then kind of use that. So what we already have now is this if statement here. So we're going to go ahead and take the arguments that are available from the function call.arguments. And we'll take a look again at this property in just a moment. But what we're going to do now here is we're going to say if function call.name is equal to create music, or if function call.name is created to create image. And then we can decide what to do next. And all we're going to need to do at this point is if it's music, we're going to call replicate.run, passing in the model name along with the input. We're setting like a base variable that we want to hard code, and then all the different arguments that are coming back. So again, this will either be one or two arguments. In the case of music, it will be the prompt or the prompt and the length. And then based on the response that came back from there, we can just take that output and pass it directly to the client. So we're saying next response.json with the data and the type of audio. All right, so that's the function call check for music. And then for image, we're going to do something very similar. We're going to call replicate.run, passing in the model, the input, and then we're going to return next response.json. And the type is going to be image. So we have type audio, image, and text. So those are the three different types of values that we'll hopefully be returning from our API. All right, that's all we have to do on the API side. What we want to do now is update our client. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just go ahead and delete like maybe all of that code there. And I will delete this flex h min screen because I don't think we need that. And I don't think we're going to need image from next image either. We'll start by saying use client because we're going to be using some like client side state here. And then we'll say import use state from React. Next, we're going to go ahead and set a bunch of local state variables. So we're going to have the input, which is going to be what the user types in. We're going to have a variable to store the image, the audio, and the text that comes back from the API. And then we're just going to have like a loading indicator. Next, we're going to go ahead and create our only function, which is going to be call API. And we'll do a little try catch block here. We'll first check to see if the user has typed anything at all. And if they haven't, we'll return. And then we'll just go ahead and reset all of our local state variables. So we'll set loading. We'll reset image, audio, and text to kind of clear the screen out. Next, we'll go ahead and take the input that the user's typed in, and we'll call fetch/API/GPT, which if you remember, that's what we have here, API/GPT. We'll pass in the query as the input, and then we'll just wait for the data and the type to come back there. And remember, the data is going to be the value, the type is going to be image, text, or audio. And what we can now do is kind of like some type of switch statement, or we can say like if type is equal to image, if type is equal to audio, if type is equal to text. And then based on those, we should be able to kind of like have whatever we need, and then we'll just set loading to false. So if the type is image, we're going to call set image, passing in the first item out of the array that came back. If it's audio, we're just going to call set audio, passing the data in directly. And then if it's text, we're going to just pass in the data directly as well. So we have set image, set audio, set text, and that's kind of it. Now all we need to do is build out a pretty basic user interface. So we're going to have a text input. And we're going to just have the value update the set input value when they type with some really basic styling where we kind of have a black text and a little bit of padding and then rounded borders. And then we have like a button with a green background. And then what we're going to do now is just render based on the type. So if an image is set, we're going to say we want to show that image. So image and we'll view the image, text and we'll view the text, audio and we'll view the audio. And then if it's loading, we'll just show a loading indicator. And that's about it. So what we should be able to do is go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to run npm start, or npm run dev actually. We're going to open up localhost 3000 here. And I will also try to show the server as well, because what we did, I believe, is log some stuff out there. So the first thing I'm going to say is, like, what is the capital of Florida? Just to see if it will return the basic text. The capital of Florida is Tallahassee. Okay, cool. So that seems to be working. Next, we're going to be testing out. Actually, let's see here. Let me minimize that. Next, I'm going to say create an image of a goldfish in a bowl. Ultra realistic. And here, if we go to our logs here, we'll see that the first one we called was no function call, but this one is saying function call is create image. And then the prompt is going to be the one we passed in. And then the arguments are going to be set as the object there. And then there you go. We see we have the image returned, which is pretty cool. And for the audio, I might just go ahead and like copy a prompt here, for example. So the audio is going to be whatever this is, whatever they have in Replicate. And we'll go ahead and run that. And if we go here, we'll see that the function call is indeed create music. And the prompt is the only argument that's being passed in to Replicate. And we'll see that we have an 8-second audio clip passed in. Now what we really want to test is the more, like, I would say advanced feature, which is kind of one of the main features actually, is being able to contextualize arguments. So we want to say 18 seconds long or something like that. And we're hoping that this arguments object is going to be updated with not only the prompt, but also the length or whatever the name of that property was. I forgot. It was, let's go here to where we define that API, the duration. So we're hoping that this next time we call it, the duration is going to be set based on us saying that we want it to be 18 seconds long. So let's try that. Let's look at what happens here. Boom. We see that we have the prompt and we also have the duration set as 18. And let's see if this indeed returns an 18-second clip. And there we go. We see that we have an 18-second clip because we asked for that. And you can now imagine how far you can extend this, because basically what this is doing, it's taking natural language and turning it into an API call that you can use in any application in any way, which is really, really cool and really, really powerful. So that's it from this video. I hope you learned a lot. If you did, please like, subscribe, and share, and look out for my next video, hopefully coming soon. Thanks.